Major revelations about the White House, Russian hacking, and those claims about wiretapping.
The FBI is investigating the Russian government's efforts to interfere.
There's not one shred of evidence, none, showing collusion between President Trump and the Russians.
He's the Fox News president. Everything that he says, we've said.
We're going to begin with the virtually non-stop coverage in the U.S. media of a news story that, upon closer examination, has very little in the way of hard evidence out there to back it up. That the Kremlin has somehow undermined American democracy, helping land Donald Trump in the White House. This past week, the FBI Director James Comey told a congressional committee that there is an active investigation into Russian collusion with Trump officials during the election campaign, but that there is still no proof it actually happened. That dominated another news cycle or two, with all kinds of conjecture offered in the absence of facts. Comey also poured cold water on President Trump's claim that he'd been wiretapped by Barack Obama, a story that started out on the conservative news site Breitbart. Later, when defending that claim, the White House quoted a story that it saw on Fox News. Now, under normal circumstances, being quoted even indirectly by a president would be prestigious for a news brand. But the Trump administration is not doing Fox any favors, because when Fox's journalism is examined, sometimes it comes up woefully short, such as it did in this case, when it was revealed that Fox relied on a Kremlin-funded news channel, RT, for some basic facts that proved to be bogus. Those pushing this story argue that Moscow is very much in the picture, but our starting point this week is at the crossroads of American politics and journalism, Washington, D.C.
Objectively, there's a lot of smoke.
There's a lot of smoke.
The question is, where's the fire?
But there hasn't been that smoking gun yet.
Leaks are coming out.
Press Secretary Sean Spicer is cracking down on leaks at the White House.
The leaks are very well orchestrated and very deliberate.
But nothing in the way of actual hard evidence.
A rare voice of disagreement against a torrent of accusations that Donald Trump and his team colluded with Russia.
And many in the Russian media, we are quite tired with it, fed up with it already.
The headlines wrote themselves, two of them. The first, when FBI Director James Comey said he had no evidence to back up the president's allegation that he had been wiretapped by his predecessor, Barack Obama.
The FBI and the Department of Justice have no information to support those tweets.
The second, when Comey confirmed an investigation was underway into the Trump administration's ties to Moscow.
This will also include an assessment of whether any crimes were committed.
Much of the rest of what the committee heard was spun for partisan purposes by the political parties involved.
Right after Director Comey said that they were doing this investigation, the Republicans really immediately turned and they focused on the question of leaks.
Do you agree much of what is learned from these programs is classified or otherwise legally protected?
And how these cases were being investigated, why so much national security information has come out recently, and what the FBI is actually doing to try and stop it.
They want to send a message that if any of these people get caught, they're going to face a very severe sanction.
It is a felony punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison.
But this isn't anything that the Obama White House didn't do to Manning and Snowden. Whistleblowers are always punished by the government. It depends what party's in power as to whether or not you care.
There has been a torrent of leaks since December. There were a bunch of intelligence officials or probably members of Congress who were leaking like a sieve. And then there's been this kind of frenzy on Twitter trying to connect the dots on Trump and his associates and their ties to various Russians.
The president himself is part of that Twitter frenzy.
I've got a tweet from the president an hour ago.
Donald Trump live tweeted the hearing, part of which was devoted to whether he had misinformed Americans about the wiretapping accusations. And Trump, once again, used his Twitter account to tell Americans something that just wasn't true.
Is the tweet, as I read it to you, the NSA and FBI tell Congress that Russia did not influence the electoral process. Is that accurate?
We've offered no opinion, have no view, have no information on potential impact because it's never something that we looked at.
Certain aspects of the Trump-Russia story, which the president calls fake news, are very real. two members of his inner circle, ex-National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and former campaign manager Paul Manafort, were forced to resign when their communications and associations with Russian officials were revealed by the media. However, the other story that has been reported by so many American journalists, that the Russians supposedly hijacked the 2016 election by hacking the emails of senior Democratic Party officials and releasing them through WikiLeaks, is beyond murky. The lack of proof that the hackers were indeed Russian or operated under orders from the Kremlin has not stopped the steady stream of related stories ever since.
And it's a new Trump scandal day after day after day. And curiously, it's almost always the Russian scandal instead of, for example, Trump releasing a budget last week where he cut Meals on Wheels, which is how we feed stay-at-home elderly people, and grossly expanded DOD. And instead, we're still harping on this Russian story day in and day out.
The feeding frenzy has featured established journalistic outlets whiffing on the basics. Late last year, the Washington Post trumpeted accusations that the Russians had hacked into the U.S. electrical grid. Within 2 days, the paper had to produce another report in which it backtracked on almost every assertion it made. And the March 6th edition of the New Yorker magazine featured a cover story that was provocative and ominous. The writers embarked on a publicity tour, including a radio interview in which they admitted unapologetically that their journalism had nothing to add to the rumor-heavy reporting coming out of D.C.
Do you feel like you were able to find out anything new about the investigations into Russia's interference in our election or the connections between Trump's team and Russia? Was there any new information we hadn't heard you were able to get?
I want to say something very clearly, which is at this point, we do not know what level of contact there was, if any contact at all. So what we know at the moment, frankly, is that there is a lot of very confusing information that's being circulated on all sides.
Spare a thought for the more discerning American news consumer, the kind who considers the source confounded by a president who does not, and who has at times reversed the journalistic food chain. Instead of conservative news outlets being fed information by the new administration, President Trump often tweets shorthanded versions of stories from those outlets, effectively endorsing what is later disproved. That, apparently, is where the Obama wiretap allegation came from, Breitbart News. And when defending his boss on that, Trump's press secretary, Sean Spicer, alleged that the British agency GCHQ did the spying.
All we're doing is literally reading off what other stations and people have reported. And I think
it turns out that Spicer was quoting a story from Fox News.
Fox News cannot confirm Judge Napolitano's commentary.
Fox has disowned that story as well as the source. The White House has not.
What we saw with Mr. Spicer citing these stories was different than what we've seen before from previous administrations. And it has created a challenge for us in the media about how do we cover that and how do we figure out how to explain to the reader where these things began and how they're being used.
It's not so much to be influenced by Fox News or even Breitbart, but it's that, Trump had to have been ignoring what he had been told in briefings. Trump trusts Fox, trusts Breitbart, but doesn't trust the experts surrounding him because he doesn't feel like he's bound by expertise and facts.
It is really the question about the credibility of Fox News and the credibility of the American media that would pick up the story if it portrays any given political actor in a way they like. And when you watch what American channels are putting out right now, it's a very glaring example of what not to do in journalism.
Another example of what not to do in journalism, quoting an RT story without checking the facts. As it turns out, that's what Fox News' source did on its GCHQ story, which turned out to be false. Then there are those who say that the Trump-Russia story is not so much an exercise in journalism as it is a coping mechanism. Because these days there are all kinds of people in Washington who can use one, and they're on both sides of the news cameras.
It's an explanation that gets a lot of people in power off the hook. It gets the Clinton machine, it gets the Democratic Party off the hook, it gets corporate media, who in 2015 alone gave Trump $2 billion in free media, so it gets corporate media off the hook.
I think Americans actually need somebody to sort of blame the Trump on, because it's very hard to admit that Trump is part and parcel, that he is the natural development of how domestic policy has been progressing in the United States for decades. And admitting that is very, very hard.
It's kind of catnip for a lot of the liberal base within the Democratic Party. The idea that Trump is this foreign import as opposed to something organic kind of also gets America off the hook in a way. And that's tempting, right?